properties enforced by local authorities. Secondly, to create a scheme binding on the insurance industry to recognise flood resilience measures in their premiums. And thirdly, to extend the flood scheme further. And I'll run through each of these today. Turning to binding planning requirements. Provided that it is within the scope of the current planning law, it is currently up to local planning authorities what property flood resilience measures are required in new build properties. They control this by setting pre-commencement conditions. This results in situations where adjacent local authorities have different requirements in the same rated flood zones. Not only is this inconsistent, but it hampers collaboration by allowing local authorities to export their flood-related problems to other areas. My bill will create a level playing field by setting minimum standards nationwide. I would hope that these minimum standards would be along the lines of the highly successful measures put in place by Hull City Council and those supported by the Association of British Insurers, who are calling for the government to pass Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act and align planning policy related to sustainable drainage systems as recommended by the Climate Change Committee. This is a common sense move that is supported by both the insurance industry and by Flood Re in their most recent review and can be supported by members across the House. This is about prevention, not cure, and about building homes that are fit for a changing future. Turning next to the issue around flood resilience and property insurance, at present there is no mandatory requirement in place for insurers to lower premiums for those homes where flood risk is mitigated by flood resilience or protection measures. This is largely due to a lack of evidence both at landscape scale and the level of individual properties. Currently, the only information insurers use in setting premiums with regard to flood risk is commercially available mapping data. Data from national and local government bodies on flood mitigation infrastructure such as lagoon barriers and sustainable drainage systems is not readily available and so not used. There is no requirement on the industry to request information at the level of individual properties, and this situation must change. On landscape and infrastructure, the relevant government agencies must make readily available the information on all flood prevention and mitigation measures in place regionally and locally. This information already exists. It is a matter of collation and access. And once available, insurers must make use of this information and incorporate it into their premium calculations. At the individual property level, discounted insurance premiums should be offered for properties with flood resistance measures installed. Indeed, this was a recommendation, Mr. Speaker, from Flood Re in its recent 5-yearly review. And the ABI's position is that insurers lack reliable data on the relative effectiveness of measures and confidence in its correct installation. Some measures, such as the raising of electrical cabling and plug points above ground level, seem self-evidently beneficial, and I have heard conflicting accounts of whether sufficient data on the effectiveness of measures already exists. However, it would be helpful to everyone concerned to have agreement and clarity on the range of effective measures on which insurers will offer discounts, as well as confidence in the competency of installers. Consumers need the assurance that if they're putting in these flood protection measures in their homes, it will not only increase resilience to flooding, but lower their premiums as well. And this is why my bill proposes a statutory certification scheme. There will need to be funding available to set the standards, and I believe it would be a very good idea to make funding available to our university and industry for the creation and production of new technologies that will lower the risk further. Turning finally to Flood Re, let me be clear, Flood Re is a good scheme and one I support, and that includes many of the recommendations in the latest 5-year review, but it has two major flaws. Firstly, it does not cover homes built after 2009, and I can see the logic in this. Houses after 2009 weren't covered both to discourage building in flood zones and because it was imagined that they would be built to be flood resilient. But the truth is that in too many cases this has simply not happened. Because of this, people find themselves, through no fault of their own, living in flood-prone areas with no flood resilience measures in place and without cover by the scheme. I hope that my bill would make it impossible to build a house without adequate flood protections in the future, but in the meantime we need to move Flood Re eligibility forward to a suitable date so that those people who, as a result of the current planning system, are not left without cover or facing very high premiums. Secondly, Flood Re needs to cover small and medium enterprises, and I appreciate that commercial insurance is different to residential insurance, and I appreciate that commercial insurance effectively has two aspects to it: the aspect of covering a business's building and the aspect covering their stock and other business needs. And I appreciate too that Flood Re may not be suitable to cover the stock and business needs part of the insurance, but why can it not be extended to cover the building aspect? Isn't covering the structural aspect of a residential building the same as covering the structural aspect of a commercial building? My bill would extend Flood Re to offer that very protection. It would allow businesses affected by flooding to be in a position to be back on their feet and trading more quickly. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this is not a party political issue, nor should it be subject for engaging in party political point scoring. It is an issue that affects people and businesses in constituencies right across the nation, represented by members of Parliament from all parties. It is an issue that will continue to affect those people and businesses, and as the effects of climate change become more acute, become deeper and wider. Many of the proposals in this bill have the support of the insurance industry and of Flood Re, and a survey carried out in my constituency over summer shows that they are also supported by many members of the public too. In many ways, it is an issue of common sense to pass this bill. Because when it comes to support for these measures today, we should remember that the tide is rising, both literally and metaphorically, and the time to act is now. And in my final comment, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank members from across the House. Unfortunately, I'm only able to choose 11 members of Parliament to mention on my bill today, but I've had such a huge wealth of support from people right across the House, which just shows the amount of concern there is in regard of flooding and flood prevention.
That the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Debbie Abrahams, Hilary Benn, Tracy Crouch, Philip Davis, Dan Jarvis, Diana Johnson, Rachel Maskell, Jim Shannon, Carl Turner, Valerie Vaz and myself, Mr. Speaker.
Emma Hardy.
Flooding Prevention and Insurance Bill.
Second reading what day?
14th of January 2022.
14th of January 2022. Well done, Emma. We now come to motion number 2 relating to the business of the House. Today, Minister, to move.
To move.
The question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 3 relating to the Committee on Standards. I will call the Leader of the House to move the motion.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper. Today's motion rescinds the House's decision of the 3rd of November to appoint an ad hoc committee. It also approves the 3rd report of the Committee on Standards, while noting Owen Paterson is no longer a member of the House. Mr. Speaker, I have listened carefully to the views expressed since the debate and decision on the 3rd of November, and I want to make it clear that members of Parliament must uphold the highest standards in public life. We expect all members to abide by the prevailing rules of conduct. Paid lobbying is wrong, and members found guilty of this should pay the necessary penalties. Our standard system must function robustly and fairly to support this, so that it commands the confidence of members and of the general public. The Government supported the principle of an additional right to appeal in the standard system in the House of Commons, and for that potential reform to be explored on a cross-party basis. The backbench amendment we supported, of course I could wait on.
Very grateful to the Leader for giving way. What happened a couple of weeks ago was an extraordinary failure of moral leadership, and I think it's given rise in the minds of many to serious questions for the first time about the character of this government. With hindsight, why did he and his right honourable friends not recognise the brazen wrongdoing of their colleague?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I think the simple answer... No, I think the honourable gentleman's heckle is unfair and unkind. I think it was simply the tragedy that afflicted Mr. Paterson, coloured and clouded our judgment and my judgment incorrectly. And it is as simple and as sad as that. The backbench amendment we supported was intended to facilitate the exploration on a cross-party basis of a standards system with a time-limited ad hoc committee. However, I regret that the amendment conflated an individual case with more general concerns. That was a mistake. Crucially, the amendment did not carry cross-part support, and that is why we have changed our approach. The Government fully recognises the role of the Committee on Standards in ensuring that the Code of Conduct reflects and fosters the highest standards of public life, and I would like to thank all the committee members and the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards for their service. We await its report on the Code of Conduct with interest. The committee performs an important role in identifying opportunities to improve the standards system, and I note that the Chairman has made a recent and helpful commitment to commission a senior judicial figure to advise on possible changes to the process. Mr. Speaker, I assure all honourable and right honourable members that I am always willing to discuss this matter further, and I hope to work with opposition members constructively on this issue. We all have the best interests of the House at heart, and I hope that, setting aside the previous debate, we will work well together in the weeks ahead. The Government... Of course, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Most grateful to my right honourable friend. I'm very grateful to him for facilitating this debate. On the 3rd of November, at column 939, my right honourable friend said that concerns have been expressed about this individual case, including the lack of examination of witnesses, of whom there were 17, the interpretation of the rules relating to whistleblowing, the application of aggravating factors, and the absence of a right of appeal. With regard to the first three, what is the current view of my right honourable friend in relation to this particular case?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the House will always have a debate when it wants to have a debate. That is how our procedures work, and they are extremely straightforward and ensure that honourable and right honourable members can come to this House and make objections if they so wish to have subjects debated on the floor of the House. I will not give way because I am trying to answer my right honourable friend. The point he makes about last week's debate is one I've already covered, that we made the mistake of conflating the two issues of the individual case with the general system, and that did not cover cross-party support. And that is why the Government has committed to working on a cross-party basis to find and grasp opportunities to improve the system. I'll be listening carefully to all the insights of members during this debate, and I commend this motion to the House.
The question is the motion on the Committee on Standards as on the order paper. I now come to the Shadow Leader of the House, Tangan Debonair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Where to start? There must be many a Government MP today scratching their heads, asking, with a reference to the greatest pop star and songwriter of all time after Schubert, how did I get here? And I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the House still seems yet to have no answer to David Byrne's eternal question. Allow me to assist. I could suggest a few good books on parliamentary process, or maybe a trip to the table office. The Leader of the House, the Prime Minister, perhaps even the Government Chief Whip could do with a bit of revision. I could point them towards some party planners in Bristol who could perhaps help them to learn the basics on how to turn some beer and some crisps into a festivity in a brewery. When the Leader of the House opened the debate 13 days ago on what should have been a straightforward motion such as the one we now have to approve a Standards Committee report, he spent his then lengthy speech from the dispatch box not proposing his motion really, but instead proposing a backbench amendment which tore through his own motion and, more importantly, tore through the standards process right in the middle of a live case. I have to ask him, when he talks of conflation, has he sat down? Was he fatigued? Were his fingers in his ears? I don't think so. Had he mastered the art of dozing off whilst appearing conscious? Because what explanation can there be for his plaintive lament the very next day, the days after, and even today on his podcast, that it was a pity that the issues of changing the standards process in the live case had become conflated, when it was literally him doing the conflating?
Spot on.
Now, I understand the right honourable gentleman may not hang on to my every word. I know. But, Mr Speaker, why was he not heeding the wise counsel of the member for Rhondda, the chair of the Standards Committee, his own former chief whip, the right honourable gentleman for the Forest of Dean, the father of the House, the member for Worthing West, and any number of others? All of us warned the leader of the House against the dangers of conflation. He was warned, yet conflate he did. He heeded none of those warnings as he led the Prime Minister's men and women up to the top of the hill and then left them there. Then came the government's screeching U-turn, which he announced the next day in business questions, and what followed then was yet more chaos. The amended motion is still in place. The motion before us today should have gone through last night, but was blocked by a single voice, for reasons which remain a mystery to me, but we may hear them shortly. But now here we are debating them. When he was asked at business questions how this sham committee, which is on the messed up motion, with a named chair, quite inappropriate, would operate with no funding, no cross-party support, the Leader of the House, I seem to recall, waved his hands at me, tried to imply that we hadn't been listening to his words, but we had. And answer came there none. Then the government resisted, absurdly, the suggested motion from my honourable friend, the chair of the Standards Committee, also resisted urging from myself and no doubt others, the motion that they could have laid there and then, last Monday, to rectify the mess they'd made, not just made, but quite improperly whipped for, given that this is a House matter. Then finally last Tuesday, it appeared on remaining orders for last night on a nod or nothing basis. Now, I confess, Mr Speaker, even I was surprised at the chaos last night as it descended into chamber farce. I really thought that the government, having admitted their mistake and squirreled away this remedy on a late night, no debate motion, surely they will have made sure that no one was going to mess it up for them again. But, Mr Speaker, oh, how wrong I was. To continue the talking heads references, this is not my beautiful house, and this government cannot sweep this under the rug. The Leader of the House has now apologised on his podcast, but will he also apologise to the House for the damage that has been done to the reputation of Parliament by this sorry affair? Now, yesterday, the Business Secretary rightly sent an apology to the Standards Commissioner, the independent Standards Commissioner, Mr Speaker, for his outrageous comments when he was sent out on a morning media round to be the government apologist for bad behaviour. So which hapless minister are they going to send out next time? Will it once again be the Environment Secretary, who was also sent out to describe this all as a storm in a Westminster teacup? If it is a storm in a Westminster teacup, Mr Speaker, it must be a very big teacup, because here we are. 13 days. 13 days. Mr Speaker, standards matter. Scrutiny matters. An independent system of holding everyone in public life to account matters. Standards should not be seen or treated as an irksome bother that you get your mates to change when you're found out. It should not be seen as something to be feared or something to be treated with such disdain, frankly incompetence and a total absence of leadership as we've seen from this sorry government over this sorry affair. Mr Speaker, to anyone who really loves democracy, standards are the bedrock of everything we do, everything. Once more, it seems I have to remind the right honourable gentleman that they are, the Nolan principles are, selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and finally, leadership. For democracy to work, for it to be trusted, these values have to be integrated into our political system, but also celebrated and welcomed. No MP must be for hire, not one. Standards should be the guiding light of every day in this place, a frame around what we do, a filter to sift out what must not be done from what must be done. Something we demand from ourselves and each other. Something we expect our staff to work to and to hold us to. When our constituents challenge us to live up to these standards, we should be proud that our democracy is working so well that they can do that. Mr Speaker, How have we got to the point where the Prime Minister has to clarify that the UK is not a corrupt country? How did we get here? How did we get here? Mr. Speaker, let's keep the upward trajectory started in 1695, which I would have thought the Right Honourable Gentleman would have appreciated, and I thought he did appreciate, making our standards stronger, our systems of accountability more effective, not weakening them as the government tried to do with, I'm afraid to say, the Leader of the House's assistance. I am glad that the Leader of the House recognises it as a mistake, but I ask him again if he will apologise to this House. I'd also ask him, when will the government bring forward the recommendations or respond to the recommendations of the Committee on Standards in Public Life 2018 on MPs' outside interests? And if he has read that report, which I'm sure he has, will he be backing Labour's motion tomorrow, which is based on that part of the Standards report on banning MPs from taking political strategy, analysts and consultancy jobs? Got the wording slightly wrong there. The government, but basically we're talking about paid directorships and lobbying jobs that MPs should not be doing. The government must accept the recommendations from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Set up after a different story, the committee set up after a different Tory scandal to strengthen the system. They must support the current inquiry into the MP's Code of Conduct, which our Standards Committee is in the middle of, in fact I hear shortly to report on. The government should only ever be in the business of updating and strengthening our system. We should never be content for the public to look at us wearily and conclude, thanks to the cynical actions of a very few, that we don't have standards when we do. Mr. Speaker, finally, we should never have been put in this position, but we were, by the benches opposite, and now they can't even clear up after themselves. We can now, today, and I hope we do, end this particular part of a sorry mess of a motion off the books by voting through the one in front of us, mercifully unamended, as it should have been 13 days ago, if only the Leader of the House had been listening then. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that this is going to be the last opportunity for this House to do the right thing and accept the report of the Committee on Standards on Owen Paterson. And I trust that no member of this House is thinking of doing anything other than supporting the motion that has been moved by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House. Passing this motion will be a step in the right direction, but it will not undo the damage that has been done by the vote of the 3rd of November. And let's be clear, this is not a party political issue. Damage has been done to all members of Parliament and to Parliament as a whole. I read the report of the Committee on Standards into Owen Paterson. I believe the conclusion was clear and fair. Owen Paterson broke the rules on paid advocacy. And the attempt by right honourable and honourable members of this House, aided and abetted by the government, under cover of reform of the process, effectively to clear his name, was misplaced, ill-judged and just plain wrong. Now, I hope the honourable gentleman will forgive me if I take no interventions. I wish to make my limited points. In this place, we set rules for people through the laws that we pass. We expect people to obey those rules. We also set rules for our own behaviour as members of Parliament. And we have a right to expect each and every one of us to obey those rules. Now, sometimes mistakes will be made inadvertently, but the process of independent investigation and a committee set up by this House with lay members should be able to differentiate those cases and to deal with them. Now, it's been suggested that as a result of what happened on the 3rd of November, the rules need to change. And I do hope that the government will be looking urgently and seriously at the 2018 proposals from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. I don't think they quite reflect the motion that the opposition is putting to the House tomorrow, but they do suggest the clarification of the rules and the tightening up of the rules on MPs' outside interests. But it would be a mistake to think that because someone broke the rules were wrong. The rule on paid advocacy is a long-standing one. The problem came because there was an attempt to effectively let off a then member of the House. And that flew in the face of the rules on paid advocacy and in the face of the processes established by this House. Now, it's also been suggested, as a result of what happened on the 3rd of November, that there are questions about the role of MPs. We should not conflate or confuse these two issues. The first is about ensuring that no company or individual can gain an unfair advantage by paying a Member of Parliament to advocate on their behalf. That is a matter for the Code of Conduct of members of this House and the rules of this House. The second is an issue of the service that MPs give to their constituents, and that is a matter for their electorate. Damage has been done to this House. We can start to repair that damage by accepting the report of the Committee on Standards, and I urge every member of this House to support this motion.
SNP spokesperson Pete Wishart.
And thank you ever so much, Mr. Speaker. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? What an absolute and utter disaster. And to see the Leader of the House standing there, no apology, no contrition, no ability to let it sink in just how bad things have come. The last place that he wanted to be today was at that dispatch box, doing exactly the opposite and saying exactly everything that he didn't say 2 weeks ago when he presented that motion. And they were doing everything possible yesterday to get to 10 o'clock so this debate wouldn't be had, only to be told by the honourable member from Christchurch with the word of object. Best laid plans and all that. So what we've got is another day of headlines, another day of examining Tory sleaze. And what has happened in these 13 days since he was last at that dispatch box? Well, we know that public trust in this government is now at an all-time low. Their inboxes have been swamped with furious constituents demanding knowing what they're going to do about all of this. Day after day, there's been endless Tory sleaze stories in the national newspapers that they've all been waking up to. Companies are now dispensing with the services of Tory MPs in these lucrative second jobs because of the stink that this has always created. And they have lost their lead in the opinion polls. Things couldn't actually be worse for them. They would actually now be faced with losing their seats if a general election was called tomorrow. And they have the Leader of the House to thank them for their current sorry predicament. This little plan to save their pal was hatched between the Leader of the House and the Government Chief Whip, backed enthusiastically by the Prime Minister, in order to have their pal saved. And this was backed enthusiastically with him. He's supposed to be the clever one. It's him that's got the Eton education, the millions in the Caymans. This is all on him, and he is responsible for this mess. Just let's remind ourselves of what he said 13 days ago. He was so passionate in his defence of his good friend Owen Paterson that he even invoked one of his favourite Latin phrases. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. He extolled us in this House in an almost Atticus Finch-like defence for his good friend. His good friend, fairly unmaligned and maltreated by this House. And for someone who had just pocketed a cool £500,000 and had been found to have broken our rules in a consistent and egregious manner, now he's here doing the exact opposite. If he had even any sense of dignity, if he had a smidgen of self-respect, he would be long gone, Mr. Speaker. You don't usually survive something like this. You don't survive a story lasting 13 days. He has defied the laws of political science, and it's amazing that we still find him at this dispatch box today. But let's remind us of what we're actually doing today. We are rescinding a committee that they whipped in order to achieve a kangaroo court committee of corruption that had a Tory majority and a Tory chair. They didn't like the result of our existing standards committee. So not only did they set aside its finding, they actually decided that they would replace that committee itself. They are so arrogant and sense of entitlements there that they really thought they would get away with it. And they would have got away with it if it wasn't for those pesky constituents. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank them for giving away, and I think that the public have made very clear over the last 2 weeks their demands for high standards. So, to be consistent with the new, more respectable position the government had, does the member agree with me that they must revisit and resile from clauses in the election bill which would allow them to, through strategic policy statements, impose their will on the Electoral Commission and to block outcomes that they don't like from that? And does the member agree that proceeding with those aspects of the election bill would make very clear that they have not learnt the lesson that messing with the independent oversight of politicians, in this case donations and spendings, is really off limits?
Absolutely, and I utterly agree with the Honourable Lady. You would think today might just be a watershed for them, that they'll look at the whole package of measures that they've had to decrease the legitimacy of this House and their electoral processes, and they would do the right thing in the back of that. But I have to say to the Honourable Lady, knowing them the way that I do, I doubt whether that might happen. I'll give way for the last time to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Honourable Member, and he's being very gracious. And indeed, I extend my sympathies to the Leader of the House for having been sent out to bat on this very sticky wicket. But would the Honourable Member agree that rather than the highly respected independent Commissioner for Standards resigning, as was mooted by ministers when they felt invincible, that rather than her resigning, it should be the Prime Minister who should be considering his position, given that he forced his Conservative MPs to vote to protect his paid lobbyist friend, rather than doing what is right, and by thereby doing, he has egregiously eroded our democracy.
Yes, well absolutely, and I'm grateful to the Honourable friend, because that brings me on to the malicious, malign attempt to undermine and smear our Standards Commissioner. Absolutely and utterly disgraceful. When we heard the Business Secretary last week saying that she should consider her position, she shouldn't be considering her position. The Leader of the House should be considering his position, as should the Prime Minister. It's because they needed to undermine the Standards Commissioner in order for the silly, stupid plan to work for them. And of course, it hasn't worked at all. So, what now? Their failure to properly apologise and to recognise what they've done and to show any sort of contrition or shame, as the Honourable Member says, means that this will not go away. This is going to go on. I mean, we're now in this 30th day. I suspect that this is going to rumble through to just about Christmas, until they get up and show this House in the country that they're truly sorry about what they've done, that they'll make every effort to try and ensure that this House is cleaned up. I'm afraid it's not going to get any better for the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues in the backbench. And I note that even the most loyal of Conservative backbenchers are actually talking about replacing the Prime Minister and ensuring that these out-of-touch Brexiteers who seem to be running the Conservative Party get no place near making decisions like this again in the future. There's a new generation of Conservatives up there. Some of them are actually even quite good. Take control of this away from them. They cannot do it. They do not know what they are doing. They have got you into this mess. It is up to you to clean them out and make sure that they're replaced. Because can I tell you something? They are not working in your interests, and they are doing everything possible to make sure that you do not get elected. I believe, Mr. Speaker, the days of faux buffoonery is coming to an end, and it's coming to an end in the back of all of this. But the Leader of the House's position, I say to him, is somebody who I respect very, very dearly. His position is totally and utterly untenable. You can't come to this House and say one thing passionately and with great concern and take up nearly all the time to do it, then come back 2 weeks later and say the exact opposite. It just doesn't happen in politics, and to even think you'd get away with it is even beyond reason, and certainly nothing like I've ever seen in my 20 years in this House. What he does is defy political gravity. He's opened a Pandora's box of Tory sleaze, and it was him that took the lid off, and we could all see what's inside of this. They think this is all over. It's not over yet. It's barely just begun.
Sir William Cash.
This motion before the House, I believe, should be viewed, as I've said in several debates so far over the last few days, from a fundamental perspective affecting all members from all parts of the House. I believe it's essential to review the workings of the fair trial system, the investigatory panel, created under the Labour government, on the recommendation of the Committee of Standards itself in 2003, which consisted of 6 Labour, 2 Liberal Democrat and only 3 Conservatives. This was to ensure fairness for MPs accused of misconduct in serious cases, as insisted upon a series of high-level reports which the House then accepted. All these high-level reports, including the Joint Committee on Parliamentary Privilege in 1999, the Wicks report and the 2003 Committee on Standards report, especially paragraphs 39 to 42, which set up the Fair Trial Investigatory Panel, made clear that the fair trial requirements would only be applied in seriously contested cases where the facts were in dispute in relation to alleged misconduct by a member. Appendix 2 of the report, third report, shows that the particular case of the former member for North Shropshire fell squarely within Standing Order 155, bracket 5, close bracket. The Standing Order clearly states the Commissioner may at any time in the course of investigating a plaint, and if so requested by the Committee on Standards, shall, I repeat shall, appoint an investigatory panel to assist the Commissioner in establishing the facts, which was not done. I am astonished at how few people seem to have either read or understood this, but it lies at the heart of the issue. No one in this House or elsewhere can say that a person was guilty or innocent unless that panel had been set up, completed its work and reported, and it was not done in this case. Not to request and thereby to require the setting up of such a panel, in my opinion, seriously impairs, in seriously contested cases, the principles of natural justice referred to specifically in Standing Order 150, affecting MPs accused of serious misconduct, of course.
I'm very grateful. I've listened very carefully to what he said. Could he just set out for the House perhaps just one example of a fact that is contested? Mr. Paterson contested the interpretation of his behaviour, but I read the report in full and I didn't find a single contested fact. Can he set it out for the House?
I'll give you one example. The question which was raised by Professor Elliott in relation to the question of public safety in relation to carcinogenic elements in ham or bacon. The point about that is this, that he is recognised, and I said in the previous debate, in 35 years, he had never come across such a case. So I think that's one example, and there are others. It also impairs, if I may say, the fundamental rules laid down by Article 6, known as the Fair Trial Provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights, drafted in accordance with British principles of justice in all civil and criminal cases. I believe that the failure to implement the requirement of the panel under Standing Order 155 does impair the report. The door to fairness is open by the setting up of this panel, and for the sake of all members of this House, I believe that it was a mistake not to have done so in this case. The failure, therefore, to adhere, for example, to the clearly defined 6 principles of fairness for accused MPs set out by the Joint Committee on Parliamentary Privilege in 1999 and Article 6 of the European Convention, including the examination of witnesses and the cross-examination of other witnesses, has adverse consequences as a precedent for Parliament itself. Not a single citizen in the land, even terrorists and criminals, is denied a fair trial under these principles of natural justice in having a right of appeal in every court and every disciplinary tribunal. And the member in question should have been afforded the procedures under these fair trial arrangements laid down by standing orders, because we as members are exceptionally excluded by Article 9 of the Bill of Rights from judicial review. The member for South Leicestershire, a member of the committee, argued convincingly that the standing orders must be reviewed to avoid conflicts of interest. The procedural reforms, which are inevitably going to be made now, need proper and full examination by the House as a whole, and not only by the Committee on Standards itself. It would be tragically too late for the former member for North Shropshire when new reforms in the near future are properly introduced.
Right, Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. They say that a week is a long time in politics, but as others have pointed out, it's almost 2 weeks, and it's hard to believe it's taken this long for the government to sort this out. Something deeply serious has now frankly become a farce. First, this government whipped on the amendment, then they U-turned, then they refused to apologise, and now having taken a week to decide what to do to sort out what is of their own creation, it was toppled last night by one of their own members. Now, it's obviously right that this motion be rescinded. I do think the Honourable Member for Stone is in a majority of one in relation to his view, and I see a lot of agreement across this House. But it does not solve many of the issues that we have seen in the past 2 weeks. The Government has not yet properly explained why it chose to whip that first vote and whether it plans to intervene in House business again. I have said it already, as have many colleagues, but Mr Speaker, standards proceedings belong to this House. The Government has authority through its majority, but it does not have the power to make changes to our rules. At the end of the day, members of the Government, like it or not, are members of this House, equal to those of us who sit on the backbenches in that regard. The Government has not yet apologised or explained why it wanted rule changes. And Mr Speaker, vague regrets for completing proceedings against an individual and the process more generally are not an apology. I know, as does any parent, that my children often regret doing something wrong when they get in trouble, but that is not the same as an apology for the action itself. As for why members of this Government want to make our standards processes less independent, well, but I think without a full explanation, with the media stories of wrongdoing over the past week, we can leave it to the public to draw their own conclusions. Finally, Mr Speaker, this Government has not explained why members with an interest in changes to the voting system, and indeed Mr Paterson himself, were able to vote in the first process. And I would argue that this is not due process. And that's why I have tabled an early day motion asking the Government to bring forward a motion for consideration by this House to amend the standing orders to prevent this happening in future. And I ask the Leader of the House if he will support bringing in such a motion, and if he does not, to explain why. We only maintain our authority in this House and reject accusations of corruption by upholding our democratic ideals. Rescinding the order from 3rd November is a vital start, but we need more, and the public needs more. Thank you.
Sir Christopher Cho.
Mr Speaker, rescinding a motion of the House when it's already been passed earlier in the session, and particularly in this case when it's been passed fewer than 2 weeks earlier, is a major constitutional decision for this House. And I think that it's absolutely right that we should be having this debate today, rather than that issue should have gone through on the nod yesterday. And I'm delighted that the Honourable Lady, the member for Bristol West, and the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Perth and North Perthshire, have enjoyed participating in this debate, having resisted the opportunity last night to insist on there being such a debate. They would have been quite happy last night for this to have been swept under the carpet. But I think it's important for this House of Democracy to debate this issue openly, and that's why I used the power of, as an individual backbencher last night, to ensure that we had this debate today, and I've got no regrets about that whatsoever. And as far... Of course I will, yes. I'm an honourable friend. So yes.
I recognise that the member is keen to make sure that this Parliament has its time to have its say. But we've had almost 4.5 hours of debate on this issue already. Do our constituents not deserve us to focus on actually delivering those promises we made to them, things that matter to them, rather than spending time here trying to deny things which would have had the same outcome no matter what? How much time does he want to give? Is it 10 hours, 5 hours, 15 hours? When will it be enough?
Should I express shock or outrage, Mr Speaker, at what my honourable friend has said? Because clearly in the time to which she's been referring, she hasn't applied her mind to the principal issue, and that is that the government encouraged everybody, including her probably, to vote for a motion on the 3rd of November. That motion was passed by resolution of this House, and for that motion to be rescinded or changed is a matter for this House rather than for the Executive and the Government. And what happened on the 4th of November was that the Government usurped its power and said to this House, basically, what you decided yesterday is no longer valid and of a good effect. And that's why this motion is so important, because we can't pass motions and then rescind them without proper debate. And that's what I'm trying to concentrate on today. The process is absolutely fundamental to the issue of natural justice. And when I raised with the Leader of the House earlier on in an intervention, I referred to 3 of the issues which he had talked about on the 3rd of November in his introductory remarks. And he expressed then concerns which had been raised with him about the lack of communication, the lack of examination of witnesses in this case, and there were 17 such witnesses available to be examined. The Leader of the House also said he was concerned about the interpretation of the rules relating to whistleblowing, which have been reinterpreted retrospectively and much more narrowly than many people would think was justified on the basis of the actual wording of those rules, and also the issue of the penalty that was recommended, because the committee decided that it was an aggravating factor for our right honourable friend, the then member for North Shropshire, to have actually raised with the committee in evidence the impact which the inquiry and the Commissioner's behaviour had upon himself and his family. No, I'm not going to give way. No, I'm not going to give way. I'm not.
What I would say is, if the honourable member wishes to give way, he will give way. I think his slight indication was that he doesn't wish to give way to Mr Harper. So, Chris, well, whether he's right or wrong is totally different to the rules of the House. Chris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I understand that some people find this rather an issue of sensitivity. And indeed, I raised a related aspect of this with the Leader of the House because the previous report of the Commission, for the Committee on Standards, had decided that colleagues who had disputed the decision of the Commissioner for Standards, that in itself was an aggravation of their penalty. And that is completely at odds with the principles of natural justice in our country. In our country, you can defend yourself, and by defending yourself in a forum, a court of law or an inquiry, that cannot be regarded as an aggravating factor. If you admit your guilt, then that can be a mitigating factor. But to defend yourself against charges cannot be regarded as an aggravating factor. And I think that this committee, in deciding as it did that the Right Honourable Gentleman, the former member for North Shropshire, by referring in his evidence to the committee to the impact of the inquiry upon himself and his family, I can't see how that could have been in itself an aggravating factor when it came to sentence. And that was an issue. And that was an issue to which my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, referred on the 3rd of November, and I think it struck a chord with many of us. Mr. Speaker, it is so important that natural justice should be allowed to take its course and be applied in our proceedings, and that we shouldn't allow ourselves to be pushed into a position of almost being subject to mob rule and mob justice, and that's why I welcome this debate, the opportunity to hear people's views about the. No, I'm not going. Mr. Speaker, I will call him my right honourable friend. Okay, my right honourable friend has got plenty of time in which to catch your eye and make his own points in his own way. But I know that he has a different view from that which I have about these proceedings. He's entitled to that view. Each of us is entitled to our own views. But what we should be doing in this democracy is actually enabling those views to be heard, and I'm delighted that this debate is facilitating just that.
Yes, Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I normally have to say that thing, there's all these things we have to say, it's an honour to follow the honourable gentleman. First of all, I'm actually going to defend his position and critique what he has said. First of all, the first critique I would say is that I have to say I found the tone in which you spoke to one of your colleagues to be, in my view, slightly unacceptable as a woman in these proceedings. But as a woman in these proceedings, I've had call to find some of the tone of the honourable gentleman problematic in the past. So nothing new there. Where I'm going to defend him, though, is that he is standing in this chamber and I love to turn up to these debates and have have it out once again. He is standing in this chamber defending a position and being barracked for that position. And I can understand why. I get it. People want this to go away. I can see why the people in this House would want that. It was the government's position 13 days ago. Yeah. And so it is slightly unusual, and notwithstanding the member for the Forest of Dean, who he would not take the intervention for, whilst saying that he liked debate. To be fair, it was never been his position. But, it's all well and good barracking him and saying we shouldn't be talking about it, but this was the government's position just weeks ago, and I think that's important to remember. I just want to go over a couple of things. The idea of natural justice, I have to say, seems incredibly to be in the eye of the beholder. I find, as somebody who has worked in the justice sector for nearly 2 decades now, it's never something that's ever said about victims. Victims are never asking for natural justice, one notes. Natural justice is a terminology that always gets pulled out when people don't like the result of something that has happened, I find. And I have to say, I feel that what happened in this case was absolutely natural justice. The honourable gentleman, Owen Paterson, was entitled all the way through to defend his case. And if what the Leader of the House said earlier about, his mind was clouded by the tragedy that had occurred. I have some sympathy for that, except it's not a mitigation that's ever offered to any of my constituents in immigration tribunals, in welfare tribunals, dreadful things that have happened to them that would never be taken into account. And so it's quite difficult when the government's policy is to mitigate only against some people and cloud their minds only against some people. In this case, all the way through, the member was entitled to defend himself, and defend himself he did considerably better than lots of members in this House who don't have £100,000 contracts would have been able to do. Because lots of people in this House, and let's not even get started on access to justice outside this House. Welcome to almost every family court in the land where people are defending themselves. He was able to access legal representation all the way through. That is undeniable. And not just legal access. Let's face it, Owen Paterson will have had considerably better access to law and silks and fancier lawyers than most people in this House. So let's not pretend he was completely and utterly blindsided by this process and that it wasn't handled fairly. It was. It absolutely was. With regard to appeal, I have some sympathy with this argument and I'm more than happy to take part in any debate about how that appeal system might work. Personally, my personal view is that the system that is used by the sexual harassment process that we set up, where judges are sit over it, is not one I would mind seeing in place. I've got to say, I think that people should be wary. They are very, very robust. They are very, very detailed. They cross-examine the evidence to the point, and in those cases, I've never once seen it come down on the side of the member. In fact, there were members in this House that are no longer sitting in here because of what that appeal said. Unfortunately, the appeal in one of the cases, the member still sits in here, regardless of the tragedy of the loss of members of staff from this place, the member for Delin. I just want to say just a tiny thing about transparency of how these things work for the public, to speak out to the public and say that I feel a little bit for the member for South Northamptonshire, because the way these things work in this House usually is that you find a backbencher who's got credibility and you make her take it through, and it's often a her. You make her take it through on behalf of the executive, and that is what I feel happened last time. And I feel that she has been totally sold down the river, and her credibility, unfortunately, which was good on these issues, has been damaged by the executive.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, I hadn't intended to speak in this debate, but since I didn't get the opportunity to intervene on my honourable friend, I just want to make a couple of very, very brief points. On the report, I fear he read a different report from the one I read. I read it in detail, and the committee absolutely gave Mr. Paterson the opportunity to present the evidence of his witnesses. They were examined by the committee, and they were in the report. The committee decided for itself that it didn't need to interview the witnesses, but it put their evidence transparently in the report. The bit I really wanted to challenge him on, though, was the personal tragedy and the impact on Mr. Paterson, which we all have sympathy for. But it's absolutely not true that the committee didn't consider it. They absolutely considered it. It's clearly in the report, and it was considered not as an aggravating factor, but as a mitigating factor when they dealt with the punishment. And I think the chairman of the committee set out clearly the precedent for paid advocacy and the punishments meted out to former members of this House. And it was fairly clear to me from what he set out that Mr. Paterson got a significant degree of leniency in terms of the proposed penalty because of the personal tragedy that I think the committee rightly reflected in their deliberations. They tempered their punishment with mercy, which I think is an absolutely proper thing to do, and I think this House would have accepted that if Mr. Paterson hadn't taken the decision of his own accord to leave the House. That's all I wanted to say, Mr. Speaker, to put the record straight, and I hadn't intended to do so. I'm grateful for you allowing me to catch your eye.
Briefly, Carl Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd not intended to speak in the debate, but I was prompted, I have to say, by the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, because it became incredibly apparent to me, and I suspect to members across this House, that had she been in charge, this chaos would never have happened. And this chaos is the making entirely of one person, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister. So when the Leader of the House comes to that dispatch box and says that actually the reason we made this mistake was because we had sympathy for Mr. Paterson,
it's not true.
It's not credible. Because what happened the very next day is that Cabinet Ministers were instructed by the Chief Whip or the Prime Minister to go out on the TV and defend it. Would never have happened under the previous Prime Minister. It need not be said, Mr. Speaker, but as I say, it became apparent to me that both the ministers sitting on the front bench were struggling to look at the Right Honourable Lady, or indeed my honourable friend.
I'm now going to go to bring in the chair of the committee, Chris Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It is 3 weeks since the Standards Committee produced our report on the conduct of Owen Paterson. It detailed a catalogue of bad behaviour. The evidence was stark and compelling. He repeatedly engaged in paid lobbying. He peddled influence for his paying clients. He repeatedly used his parliamentary office to run a commercial enterprise. Every single MP I have spoken to who has read the report tells me he was guilty. And yet here we are. If at first you don't succeed, try again. I confess I am still completely mystified why the Prime Minister decided to move heaven and earth to prevent Owen Paterson from being sanctioned. Today's motion, however, is in precisely the words that I gave to the Leader of the House last Monday, as I think he'll confirm. It is necessary, I'm afraid, for 2 reasons. Firstly, the motion that was carried on the Wednesday, the 3rd of November, set up an alternative Standards Committee that was going to be chaired by the Right Honourable Member for Malden. I am told that the Prime Minister told Conservative members at the time that this had been squared off with the opposition. This was not true. Since not even the Right Honourable Member for Malden wants to sit on the committee, we probably ought to get rid of it. Secondly, the motion of the 3rd of November parked the question of whether Mr Paterson was guilty. This suggests that the House is uncertain what it thinks about paid lobbying. I hope that that is not the case, and I hope that if we have a unanimous vote this afternoon, or unanimous decision this afternoon without a division, that will prove the case. In effect, without this motion, both the committee and the report are in limbo. And I'm not an expert on the theology of the Catholic Church, but I understand that the Catholic Church now believes that limbo doesn't exist. So we really ought to put these 2 issues beyond doubt. Mr Speaker, I wish this could have been otherwise. Mr Paterson and his family must have been through hell over the last year since Rose Paterson took her own life. It is a matter of deep regret to me that the parliamentary shenanigans of the last 3 weeks can only have added to that misery. This House has done him and his family no favours. We should be ashamed of what has happened here. But sadly, Mr Paterson's was not the only catalogue of bad behaviour. As countless Conservative MPs have said to me, and incidentally, I would just like to praise a lot of the new Conservative MPs who have shown far greater insight over the last 3 weeks than some of their more long-standing colleagues. As countless of them have said to me, the way the government and the Prime Minister have handled this has been shameful, and it has brought the House into disrepute. It was just wrong to delay the original motion. Wrong to change the rules at the last minute of a disciplinary process for a named individual. Wrong to whip members on a standards report. Wrong to call for the Commissioner to resign. Wrong to refuse to table this motion last week. Wrong to try and get away with just taking this motion last night without debate. Just plain wrong, and the government knows it. I just want to respond to one point from the Right Honourable Member for Christchurch. The real aggravating point was not anything that he's mentioned. It was the fact that Mr Paterson endlessly and repeatedly kept on saying he would do the same again tomorrow. That was bound to keep on bringing the House into further disrepute, and of course we had to bear that in mind as an aggravating factor. Mr Speaker, I hope it is helpful if I say a few words about appeals. We, on the committee, have been grappling with this for some time, and I expect we will be able to say more when we report formally to the House before Christmas. We're in the process of appointing a senior judicial figure to help us think through all of these issues, as I told the House last week. It is wrong, however, to say, as several have, that there is no appeal process now. There is. A member can appeal the Commissioner's decision that there has been a breach of the rules. The Committee on Standards hears that appeal, with 7 lay independent members and 7 members of this House. Unlike most appeal bodies, we are remarkably generous. We do not specify grounds for appeal and effectively allow not just an appeal, but also a general rehashing of all the arguments. We can also hear an appeal in writing and in person, unlike most courts, and often a member chooses to do both, as Mr Paterson did. We honestly give every single member a fair hearing. We do not always agree with the Commissioner.
There are, however, some blurred lines here. We could tighten up the grounds of appeal, but I just warn colleagues that that might not go down all that well. We could constitute ourselves as two panels, as the independent expert panel does. One to hear the original decision and determine a sanction, another to hear an appeal. We could engage an outside figure to hear that final appeal, or we could ask the independent expert panel to do that. But this is not as simple as some might suggest, and the corollary might be that the House would then have to take the sanction motion without debate or amendment, as it is required to do in sexual harassment cases. I am, however, extremely reluctant, and I would urge the House to oppose this, the idea of moving from an inquisitorial system to an adversarial one. That would require everyone to be legally represented. That would benefit wealthy MPs over poorer MPs unless there's going to be legal aid provided for MPs when it's not now available in many other places. It would dramatically increase the cost of the proceedings and significantly extend the process. It would be disproportionate. It would not be any fairer to the member or the complainant. Just some final points. The Telegraph today reported a government source as dismissing the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards and the advisor on the Ministerial Code as bureaucrats who should be ignored. I'm glad the Business Secretary has apologised for calling for the Commissioner to resign, though I suspect he wasn't freelancing at the time. But leadership in this field means backing the independent system, not seeking to undermine it. As sure as eggs is eggs, there will be more cases before the Commissioner and before the committee in the next few months. And I hope nobody will seek to undermine either of them. I want to pay tribute both to Catherine Stone, the Commissioner, and to all of her team who have worked tirelessly over these few weeks, despite some extreme bullying. That same source in the Telegraph, Mr. Speaker, also said that backroom talks between parties on an appeals process for MPs have already begun. This is, I'm afraid, completely untrue. There have been no approaches to the opposition parties or to me as chair of the Committee of Standards or to the Standards Committee. It is untrue, and I hope that briefing will stop. Thirdly, I hear talk of all sorts of proposals about how we should change the system. I would just urge honourable members to calm down a little. The last 3 weeks have been shameful for this House. We need a return to due process. The committee will produce a report very soon, certainly before Christmas, and hopefully even before Advent. All you have to do at Advent is wait a little.
The question is, the Committee on Standards motion, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye! The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Finance number 2 bill, second reading.
No. Has there been amendments? I inform the House that the Speaker has selected the amendment in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Minister to move second reading. Lucy Fraser.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the bill be read a second time. On Sunday, MPs across this House remembered all those who died in conflict. And it is now 76 years on from the time we started to rebuild our country from the devastation of World War II. The bombs that rained down during that war caused enormous loss of life. They tore our cities apart. In London, air raids wrecked or razed to the ground some 116,000 buildings. And in Liverpool and Bristol, tens of thousands of buildings were damaged or destroyed. But while the war left a mark on the nation that lasts until this day, those dark years were also followed by a period of reconstruction and renewal. In 1951, the iconic Royal Festival Hall opened in London as the centrepiece and legacy of the Festival of Britain. In the 1960s, Liverpool built his extraordinary Metropolitan Cathedral, while the iconic Severn Bridge was constructed near Bristol. Today, we are living in very different times, and we have thankfully not experienced the devastation like that here again. But we share some parallels with our wartime predecessors. As we emerge from the pandemic, our city's buildings may remain intact, but jobs, families and livelihoods have been at risk, and some have been damaged by the worst economic shock in 300 years. So it is right that we too now rebuild and turn our attention to creating a better future for this country and its people. Last month, the Chancellor started that work. His budget set out our plans for the stronger economy that will allow Britain to succeed. An economy of stronger growth, stronger employment and stronger public finances, with higher wages, high skills and rising productivity. And this finance bill will achieve that. Madam Deputy Speaker, before I turn to the bill's main measures, I'll talk about its context. Our economic situation has improved since the last finance bill. We've moved away from emergency support to focusing on our recovery, which is now well underway. In fact, the economy is expected to bounce back to its pre-COVID levels by the turn of the year, earlier than was expected in March, while our economic plan to safeguard jobs, livelihoods and businesses has worked. And as a result, we can now invest in better public services, in jobs and skills, and in levelling up the country, so we open opportunity to everyone, everywhere. However, we shouldn't forget that debt is still at its highest level as a percentage of GDP since the early 1960s, and is set to pass 1.3 trillion. And whilst this level of borrowing is still affordable, it leaves us vulnerable if another crisis hits. So we must continue to create a stronger economy that can withstand financial shocks. That's why the Chancellor announced a new charter for budget responsibility with 2 fiscal rules that will keep us on the right track. I want to focus on 3 aspects of the budget in this finance bill. Support